So my name is Steve Strauss. I'm a professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at OSU, and I'm director of the OSU Outreach and Biotechnology Program. Tonight's lecture is the first of 5 this academic year and marks the start of the 3rd year of this Food for Thought lecture series. The series focuses on biotechnology and related environmental and agricultural issues. The lecture theme this year is entitled Unifying Ideologies, Food System Technology, Society, and Sustainability. It seeks to consider the higher level explanations for why biotechnologies, as well as other complex environmental and technology issues, can be so hard for people to come together around, and how we might be able to avoid or better manage our differences in the future. The lecture series is sponsored by the American Society for Plant Biology, the Weight and Lowest Rising Lectureship Fund from the OSU College of Agricultural Sciences and the OSU College of Forestry. Raoul Adamchak and Pamela Ronald are faculty members at UC Davis. Raoul has a BS in economics from Clark University and an MS in agricultural development from UC Davis. From 1987 to the present, he has been involved in numerous aspects of organic agriculture, from being an organic vegetable grower to an organic inspector, and has for a number of years been the coordinator of the UC Davis Student Organic Farm, a job that includes farm worker management, marketing products to a number of restaurants and groceries in the Davis area, training dozens of students each year on the farm, and teaching courses in organic agriculture. Pamela Ronald has obtained a BS from Reed College, an MS from Stanford, a PhD from UC Berkeley, and was a postdoc at Cornell. Pam's research also takes her to many different parts of the world. She just returned from Bangladesh, and if any of you came to the lecture this afternoon, you heard her talk about some of her work on the genetics of flooding tolerance in rice. Pam has a very impressive academic record, which you might be glad to hear I'm not going to bore you with, but when someone like me takes a look at it, you sort of hold your breath and say, wow, how does all that stuff happen in terms of grant activity, scientific publications, lots and lots of invited lectures. Also, lots and lots of service. Pam served on the editorial boards of a number of journals. She's the co-director presently of the UC Davis Chevron research program in renewable energy technologies. That's funded at about $25 million per year. And she's chair of the university-wide Plant Genomics Program. Pam also is very involved in service that goes outside of the university and outside of science. She's very involved in lots of policy and outreach activities, and of course, her appearance tonight is an example of that. Pamela and Raoul will speak tonight on the subject of their recently published book, copies of which I hope you've seen are available for sale in the foyer, and also at the OSU bookstore. Hopefully there'll be some there tomorrow. Dave Harry and I, who worked with me on selecting the lecturers for this year's series, have been looking for some time for what we consider credible scholars that are broad-minded enough and simply brave enough to navigate the DMZ between genetically intensive agriculture and organically certified agriculture. As I think you will hear, all types of crop genetic engineering, regardless of the gene, trait, or benefits, are considered fundamentally against the principles of organically certified farming, and thus legally excluded from its intentional use. On the other hand, the proponents of genetic engineering in agriculture see the many dogmas and shortcomings of the organic system, including its inconsistent scientific record for health and environmental benefits and high cost to consumers, and write it off out of hand. The fights among the two resemble those among certain religious groups in countries where the U.S. is at war, though mostly, though not always, I must say, stopping short of violence. So do these powerful divisions really make sense? Is there a better way? Our speakers tonight think so, and have made a marriage out of that other way, academically and personally. I applaud their courage and wisdom in speaking out, given the acrimony and the toxicity that often meets such efforts. The title of their book, as you can see, is Tomorrow's Table: Organic Farming, Genetics, and the Future of Food. Some recent reviews of this book suggest that many on both sides of this debate think they have provided a clear, even-handed, and reasoned view. In Science magazine this month, Mark Tester wrote, quote, "Unlike most protagonists, Ronald and Adamchak do not crudely lump every GM crop as though they are all the same. That oversimplification blurs the issues to the detriment of fruitful consideration of topics that are increasingly important in a world in which we need to produce more food, fiber, and fuels in the face of global environmental change." In an editorial in the most recent issue of Organic Gardening magazine entitled "Looking Forward," Scott Meyer wrote, quote, "You will see in this issue an excerpt from a provocative new book written by a scientist and an organic farmer who assert that the tools of biotechnology could be useful to sustainable agriculture. This premise may be viewed as heresy by many in the organic movement, but when I read the book, I was reminded of the words of our visionary editor, Robert Rodale, that biotech will have to be part of that environmental solution, and it will have to blend into a whole landscape of farm and garden methods that will be asked to regenerate instead of degrade the environment. Please help me to welcome Pamela Ronald to Oregon State.
Thank you, Steve, for that very kind introduction and also for organizing this visit. We're very honored to be here, and we appreciate all of you for coming tonight to listen to us. So you may think that organic farming and genetics represent opposite ends of the agricultural industry, and you may even think that organic farmers can't talk to each other. Well,
organic farmers and genetic engineers can't talk to each other.
But in fact, it's easy to have a conversation because our goal is the same, a future sustainable agriculture. So over the years, many of our friends and family and colleagues have asked us what genetically engineered crop means for the human health and the environment. And on the other hand, many of our scientific colleagues have asked us if organic farming can produce enough food to feed the growing population. So this book is our response to those questions, and what we attempt to do in the book is to give, to really distinguish between fact and fiction in the debate on crop genetic engineering, and we also bring the reader into our lives to give the reader a better idea of what organic farmers and geneticists do on a daily basis. So the thesis of our book is that the judicious incorporation of two important strands of agriculture, genetic engineering and organic farming, is key to helping feed the growing population in an ecologically balanced manner. So we split up the talk. My husband Raoul will begin, and then I will continue after that.
Steve, in his introduction, did echo something that I feel about our book, and that is that it has something to offend everyone. So I hope it speaks to you. So I'm going to regress a little bit here. What kind of agriculture do we have now? The conventional ag system, as many of you are probably aware, is a system that produces abundant food and has produced cheap food for a long time here, but at the cost of the environment. There are the impacts of pesticides on the environment, the impact of synthetic fertilizers on the environment, the impact of farming practices that cause soil erosion are serious problems, ongoing problems that we still face today, even though you don't hear so much about it in the news. People don't talk about them as much as they once did. They're still unresolved problems. As an example, in California, where we're from, in 2004, there were 180 million pounds of pesticides used. And that number, you'd think, well, that's going down, right? That's not going down. In recent years, it's actually gone up a few million pounds more. And that was associated with 1,200 pesticide-related related poisonings. In your state here, looked up in 2007, there were 40 million pounds of pesticides used. In the U.S., there are hundreds of millions of pounds overall of pesticides used. And this not only leads to environmental degradation, but it has long-term health impacts, increased risks of cancer and Parkinson's disease and other serious health issues. But the U.S. is not the end of the story. 20% of pesticides are used in less developed countries. Here is a potato grower in Peru who's happily spraying pesticides without gloves on or a respirator on. And as a consequence of behavior like this, the World Health Organization estimates that there are 3 million cases of severe pesticide poisoning each year that result in 300,000 deaths in less developed countries. Synthetic fertilizers, conventional ag depends upon synthetic fertilizers. And here is a slide from China where a farmer is applying these synthetic fertilizers by hand. I have a slide coming up that shows how many millions of tons of fertilizers are applied in Asia, and it takes a lot of people to apply that many millions of tons of fertilizers by hand. But synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizers, their big problem is that they're very soluble. They contaminate groundwater and surface water. I don't know if you've ever been in California, but if you drive down I-5 and you get about halfway down the valley there and you stop off at a rest stop, above the water fountain sign, above the water fountain, there's a sign that says, if you're pregnant or you're young, don't drink the water because the nitrate levels in this water are unhealthy to drink. So there's this nitrate issue of groundwater contamination and surface water contamination all around the country. Here's that slide that I had of world fertilizer use, and press the right button, there it is. Millions of metric tons used from 1961 to 2000. You can see the great increase in synthetic fertilizer use in Asia over that period of time. You know, I think of North America as being the area where synthetic fertilizers are used, but the rest of the world is outpacing us. So the total here is 140 million metric tons a year. And the other downside to this is that it takes the equivalent of 30 gallons of gasoline in energy to provide the nitrogen fertilizer to fertilizer an acre of field corn in the Midwest. So if you multiply all these pounds by the amount of energy that it took, it's an astronomical amount of energy that's being put into creating synthetic fertilizers. This is a satellite photo of the turbulence. It's the wrong button. Of the turbulence that forms at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and these red areas are areas that are low in oxygen. And what happens is that all the fertilizers from the Midwest come down the Mississippi River, come out the mouth of the Mississippi where algae blooms and there's a lot of plant growth. As they break down, bacteria, when they break them down, take all the oxygen out of the water, and these become dead zones. No oxygen, no aquatic life at all. So the impact of fertilizers is both local, but it's also national and international as it impacts environmental systems. Finally, agriculture, as I said, causes soil erosion. Here's a map of soil erosion around the world. 30% of the world's arable land has become unproductive so far due to soil erosion. 60% of that ends up in rivers and streams and lakes. Soil erosion means also that the fertilizer that was in the soil is eroded as well. The orange areas show very degraded soils around the world, but you notice if in areas where there isn't any agriculture, there's no soil erosion. There's no vegetation either. Okay. So if we continue with our current farming practices, we're going to end up with more of the same. More soil erosion, more fertilizer contamination of aquatic systems, more pesticide-related injuries, more loss of wild species. So there has to be a better way to resolve this need for increased food production while minimizing its impact on the environment and on us too. So the better way, people have talked about it a lot, is to design some sort of sustainable agriculture. And we've developed some criteria here of what the goals of a sustainable agriculture should be. And they include, of course, providing abundant, safe, and nutritious food, reducing harmful environmental inputs like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, reducing energy use. Although the price of gasoline has gone down below $2, it's not going to stay there for long, and we need to reduce as much energy use as we can. We need to build soil. We need to build soil and to reduce soil erosion. We need to enhance crop genetic diversity in order to minimize the impact of diseases and insect outbreaks. Very important to my heart, we need to maintain the economic viability of farmers and of rural communities. If farmers can't make a living, they don't farm, we don't eat. We need to protect biodiversity, and that's in two ways. One, we need to protect biodiversity from the impact of pesticides that kill beneficial insects and birds and soil organisms. But we also need to protect biodiversity by minimizing the expansion of agriculture, because agriculture itself is a wonderful destroyer of biodiversity. If you have a rainforest and you chop it down to grow crops, you've wiped out a lot of plants and animals. So one of the goals is to minimize the expansion of agriculture. And finally, an important goal is to improve the lives of the poor and the malnourished. We're very well fed here, but there are many parts of the world where their diets are not quite as extravagant as ours. One of my students came back from the Peace Corps and described she was living in Niger, and she ate ground up millet with okra sauce that was made from dried up okra pods, and water was added and it was turned into a mush. They ate that 3 times a day in her village, millet and okra sauce. And as she described the making of it, I couldn't have imagined making it in such a way that it would taste worse. But it's an example of what's going on. So, as many of you also know, organic agriculture came about as a response to these problems of conventional agriculture, in response to pesticide use, in response to synthetic fertilizer use, in response to soil erosion. And here's my farm right here. Recently, so organic agriculture, in trying to resolve the issues of conventional agriculture, focuses on the health of crops, animals, farmers, the environment, and consumers. Organic agriculture uses 97% fewer pesticides than a conventional system, and instead we control pests through crop rotation, the support and enhancement of beneficial insects and other organisms, resistant varieties, and naturally occurring pesticides. This is a photo of our compost turner at the student farm. And this windrow, I think this compost pile was done, but our field manager wanted to turn it one more time. But we take animal waste from the dairies and the horse barns and the pig barns at the UC Davis campus and turn it into compost here at the farm. And that's one of the main fertilizer sources for our fields. And it solves two problems. It produces nutrients for our farm without significant energy inputs, but it also recycles this waste out of the ag system and gets it back onto the field. And that's another thing that the conventional ag system has really failed at, which is returning agricultural waste, animal waste, and getting them back to the field. The other way that organic farmers add to the fertility of their soil is through cover crops. And this cover crop was planted in October. This is a mix of bell beans and vetch that we have at the farm. And by March, it'll be about this tall and very dense. And it'll fix about 150 pounds of nitrogen out of the air, because these are legumes and they take nitrogen for free out of the air and put it into the soil. Cover crops also reduce nutrient runoff and soil erosion. If you went around Davis right now, the organic fields that aren't being farmed right now are planted to cover crops, and the conventional fields are bare. There's nothing. They've been bedded up, herbicided, no weeds, no crop. It's going to rain, I hope, in California, and there's going to be soil erosion, but people don't seem very concerned about it. Let's put it that way. Organic agriculture also has benefits in developing countries because it requires fewer external inputs, including energy, and it's more suitable for location where these inputs are either very costly or just not available. So the question that Pam and I have talked about is organic agriculture enough then to solve all these problems and to provide abundant food? And that's an interesting question. One of the more important issues is yield. And if you look at all the studies comparing organic and conventional yields, sometimes the yields are comparable and sometimes they're not. And for some key crops such as rice, I've been an organic farm inspector and have inspected a lot of organic rice farms. And the weed issues on organic rice farms can be so drastic that the yield is reduced from 30 to 50% compared to conventional farms. And so the rice growers accepted those yield losses because the prices for organic rice were quite a bit higher. But in a country unlike ours, in Bangladesh or India, those sorts of yield losses would mean people didn't eat. And so it's an important consideration when we're thinking not only of us but of the world. Yield becomes very, very critical. There are also some pests in organic agriculture. No, there are some pests that are difficult to control using organic methods. we have on our farm a pest called symphyllans, which is a arthropod, insect-like pest that eats the roots of crops. And it, not only do crops not grow, weeds don't even grow. And there's some spots where they're, you know, it's so severe that we just have bare spots. There are also viruses and nematodes and other diseases that can be very challenging to control using organic methods. Another issue that we actually don't have here is that there are many parts of the world where there are environmental stresses. There's salt in the water, there's flooding, there's cold, there's one more.
We have cold here.
No, cold. They have cold here? All right. That's true. And all those environmental stresses can impact the food supply. And it seems like any opportunity we can provide that can address some of those problems can help increase the food supply. And organic agriculture per se can't deal with increased salt tolerance or increased tolerance to submergence. Presently, also, organic agriculture comprises only 3% of all agriculture, and that's increasing, which is a positive thing. But there's still 97% of the farmers out there that would argue that it's a good idea. And finally, organic agriculture has produced a lot of food and a lot of high-quality food. In this country especially, that high-quality food has had a higher price, and that can reduce the availability to low-income consumers, which can be a serious issue. Okay. So the situation in the world is that right now there are 1 billion people undernourished, 33% of children less than 5 in less developed countries, and every day 24,000 die from malnutrition of one sort or the other. And it's estimated that by the year 2050, this population is going to increase from 6.7 billion to 9.2 billion. And we would like to think that we would be able to produce the food to feed all these people. And there are arguments made of, well, that's an awful lot of people, and can we feed them all, and what's the impact of that on the earth? But the alternative is not feeding them and allowing millions, if not billions, of people to starve. And, you know, Pam and I think that's not the proper choice. So with without additional yields, maintaining even the food consumption that we have now would require a doubling of the world's cropland if the population is going to increase that much. And that would result in deforestation, reduction of biodiversity, strain on water systems, and cause a lot of soil erosion. So the question that arises, because Pam and I can talk to each other because we're married, is can modern genetic approaches such as genetic engineering contribute to sustainable agriculture? And we have two important, well, here at first we have one important concept that we insist upon, and that is each GE crop needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to see that it meets our criteria for sustainable agriculture. So if you remember what some of those were, abundant and healthy food, reduced pesticide use, reduced soil erosion, support farmers. If a genetically engineered crop doesn't meet those criteria and doesn't help forge a sustainable agriculture, then we don't think it's worth supporting. And that evaluation may depend on the crop, it depends on the location, and it may depend on farming practices. So Pam is going to try and answer that question of whether genetically engineered plants can aid sustainable agriculture.
Thank you.
I'll sit down over here.
Okay. So I thought I would start with plant breeding and remind you about conventional crop modification. And think about the corn that Native Americans were eating 8,000 years ago. It looked like this. So this is a sort of a progenitor of modern day corn. And to get into the grain, you need a hammer to break the grain open. And compared to modern varieties, the modern varieties have 100-fold more food on each year than the more ancient varieties. And so this concept of natural, this corn that we eat today would not have occurred naturally. This is a product of domestication. It's a product of a lot of people's hard work, starting with the Native Americans, who picked out very interesting mutations that were naturally occurring and then made crosses. And through modern breeding, we have ended up with very abundant, high-yielding varieties. So everything we eat has been domesticated, except for maybe the blackberries that you can pick out around Oregon that have evolved here, although I understand some of them are from the Himalayas, but you also have some native blackberries. Basically, everything we eat has been domesticated by breeders and by geneticists, and we rely on that breeding for our food supply. So I wanted to just explain what genetic engineering is and another type of modern genetic modification called precision breeding. So these are modern approaches to seed modification. So they're different than conventional breeding, but some people argue that it's sort of the modern form of conventional breeding. So there's basically just two differences. So with genetic engineering or precision breeding, only 1 to few genes are introduced. So conventional breeding, because breeders have not in the past had any information about the genetic components, so basically the crosses were made and a large group of uncharacterized genes were mixed together. So that's the reason it's called precision breeding, because we know that the genes that we're introducing, they've been very well characterized. The other difference for genetic engineering is that genes from any species can be introduced. So you can bring in a bacterial gene, a fish gene, anything you want. It's very easy. Students do it in high school now. So that is the main difference. You can do this with genetic engineering. Precision breeding, although it requires modern genetic methods, you cannot bring in genes from other species. And we could talk about that difference later if people are interested. So these are the two differences from modern breeding from conventional genetic modification that resulted in our hybrid maize and other hybrid varieties that we eat today. So the result is the same. Both conventionally modified and modern approaches to seed modification result in a crop plant, a domesticated crop plant that produces seed. And in the seed then will produce different seed that can be saved by farmers if there's no other intellectual property restrictions, for example. But aside from that, it's just a seed and it can be replanted. So today I wanted to keep it fairly simple. I'm just going to give you 3 examples of genetic engineering and precision breeding that are addressing problems that were difficult or even impossible to address through conventional breeding or organic farming. So the first couple examples will be resistance to insects and viral disease. And the last example I'll give will be work from my laboratory that we've been working on for about 13 years. So this is the cotton bollworm. He is emerging from his egg, and he's about to start eating. And he can eat a lot. He's a big problem to cotton growers all over the world. And in fact, cotton, just a single crop, uses 25% of the world's insecticides. These insecticides are not benign. The Environmental Protection Agency considers about half of the pesticides used to control this one insect to be possible or known human carcinogens. So this is where Raoul and I feel the attention should be focused, is how do we reduce applications of these types of toxic pesticides. Not all pesticides are toxic, but some certainly are. So the story goes like this. So this comes from organic farmers. They were very clever. Many years ago now, it was discovered that a naturally occurring soil bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis was producing an insecticidal protein called Bt. And this small protein has been really interesting because it kills the cotton bollworm. It's very specific for the type of pest that it kills, and it does not affect other types of insects, and it does not affect humans or other animals. So this particular protein called Bt toxin has been used since the 1930s by organic farmers. So it's been a favorite tool of organic farmers. It's a naturally occurring pesticide, and it's very effective in controlling many different types of insect diseases. So then the geneticists came along, and so then I should mention that although this can be sprayed, so what happens is this bacteria is grown in these large industrial vats, and it's then processed into a powdered form, and organic farmers will spray it on the field. So it's effective for some particular insects, but not for all. It depends on, again, on the crop and the location. So what geneticists did was they just cloned the gene that encodes this particular protein, and they put it directly into the crop. So now instead of spraying the dead bacteria on the crop is producing a single protein. And we now have about 10 years of data, which is very encouraging. So this Bt cotton, it's called Bt cotton. This is the genetically engineered cotton carrying this gene from the bacterium. It kills 90% of cotton bollworms. And after the adoption of Bt cotton, within a couple of years in China, insecticide use fell by 156 million pounds. So just to give you an idea of how much insecticide was reduced, that's almost equal to the total amount we spray in California. And California supplies 50% of the fruits and vegetables in the United States. So that's a lot of insecticide reduction. In India, where farmers cannot afford pesticides, so they just let the pests feed on the crop generally. Once they started planting Bt cotton, their yields increased 80%. And these dramatic increases in yield are seen because they didn't have access or money for the pesticides. And this is compared to neighboring crops growing conventional cotton. So we think this is a good thing, reduction in insecticide. In Arizona, growers were able to cut their insecticide use in half while maintaining the same yield as their neighbors. In addition, compared to conventional growers, insect biodiversity actually increased in the fields. And this is measured by looking at the number of ant and beetle species. And it makes sense. If you're spraying less insecticide, you're going to have more insects in your field, hopefully beneficial type insects. So one point that we like to make in the book is that you can't just rely on a single tool. So genetically engineered crops are simply seed. And any organic farmer knows that seeds are only part of the equation, that integrated farming practices are also needed to really have a productive crop. And in fact, in China, after 7 straight years of dramatically reduced insecticide use, populations of other insects began to increase, and that's because the farmers were using less insecticide, so they weren't controlling other insects that were attacking the crop. So the farmers, because they weren't using integrated organic practices or organic control measures had to start spraying certain kinds of pesticides again. They still are using a lot fewer pesticides, but we think they could use even fewer if they integrated this genetically engineered crop with organic farming methods. So, and one of the examples is you can introduce beneficial insects and then you can rotate your crop. So these simple organic approaches would really enhance the longevity and the usefulness of genetically engineered cotton. So the second story is papaya, which this is a papaya that's infected with papaya ring spot virus. So viral diseases of plants are some of the most difficult control, and you can think of viral diseases of humans such as HIV, a very serious disease, not a lot of solutions, but a lot of research. So plants also have the same vulnerabilities to viruses, and in fact, papaya was grown for many years on the island of Oahu. In the 1950s, the entire papaya growing orchards were completely wiped out by this single virus. There was no conventional approach to control this disease. There was no organic approach to control this disease. The growers had no other choice but to stop producing papaya on this island and move to another island. So they moved the production to the island of Hawaii. So in 1992, and this was predicted by plant pathologists, we know viral diseases spread, and it was predicted that the virus would somehow move to the other island, and usually this is carried out because a papaya, infected papaya from one island gets moved to the other. So the virus was discovered in Hawaii. And by 1995, the production plummeted. There was about a 50% reduction in yield. Well, there's a hero to the story. This is Dennis Gonzalez. He grew up in Hawaii, and he carried out his studies at Cornell University, and he was aware of this problem. So he began a long process to engineer papaya for resistance, and he actually was one of the pioneers in genetic engineering, and he started doing some experiments with a lot less knowledge than we have today. So what he did is he took a small snippet of DNA from a mild strain of the virus, and he spliced it into the papaya genome. And the reason he did this is because biologists had noticed that when there's a mild form of the virus around, the severe form cannot infect. And a simple way to think about this is sort of like human vaccinations against polio and smallpox. So these two diseases have been virtually eradicated from the human population because we've been immunized with mild strains of these very severe and deadly viruses. And so Gonzalez then was able to immunize papaya against further infection. So remember, the engineered papaya has a snippet of the viral genome, whereas the non-engineered papaya has a lot of viral RNA and protein because the virus is replicating. And of course, so papaya that you used to buy, and maybe even today that's marked organic, is likely full of viral RNA and protein. Well, it's not going to hurt you. It's a plant pathogen, but it's not so great for the farmers. So the genetically engineered papaya yielded 20 times more fruit than non-genetically engineered papaya. And I like this story because this work was supported by a very small grant from the USDA. It was a nonprofit source. By 2003, 90% of all papaya was transgenic. The farmers really embraced it. And interestingly, the organic growers also benefited because there was less viral inoculum around. So you can imagine a room full of people with the flu, well, it's going to be contagious. But if suddenly you've immunized 90% of the people in the room against the flu, you're going to have less of the viral spread. We are going to be visiting Hawaii soon, and we'll be interested in looking at the types of practices there, because if organic practices have not been integrated into the genetically engineered papaya plantations, then we're going to have other types of problems. There will still be fertilizer runoff. There may be pesticides used to control other insects. So I wanted to finish with work from my own lab. Some of you were at the lecture earlier this morning. This is a very truncated version of this work. So we know that 25% of the world's rice is grown in flood-prone areas. So rice feeds half of the world's population. It's a staple food for half the human beings on the earth. And much of it is grown in these areas. These are the Himalayas. Here we have eastern India, Bangladesh, Burma, or Myanmar now, Thailand. There's a lot of rice grown in this area, and these areas are prone to flood. In this area, there's 75 million people that live on less than $1 a day. So these are subsistence farmers. They don't have food, they don't have money to buy other types of food often. And in Bangladesh, for example, the diet of the average Bangladeshi is 2/3 rice. So the issue then is, what I should say is, you think of rice as growing in flooded areas, and it really likes water, and water is spread to reduce weeds. But the rice is above the water in a successful farming system. If there's a flood and the rice is completely submerged, within 3 days, virtually every rice variety will die. They cannot survive complete submergence. There's not enough light, there's no photosynthesis, there's limited gas exchange, and the plant just uses up its carbohydrate reserves and it dies. So interestingly, in the 1940s, in this eastern area of India called Orissa, there was a submergence tolerance line that was identified. And this line had really amazing properties. It could stay underwater, completely submerged for 14 days. At the time, there was no other rice variety that had this property. But it was not in production, and it's because it looks like this. It looks like a weed. It's very poor grain quality, very, very low yielding, so people were not using it. Conventional breeders tried to introduce this submergence tolerance trait into varieties that were locally adapted and favored by farmers, but they failed because they did not have enough genetic information. They did not really, they could not bring in the trait of interest without bringing in other negative traits. So the farmers did not accept the varieties that were developed. So in 2006, my laboratory isolated a submergence tolerance gene called SUB1. And we were able to show by genetic engineering that the addition of a single gene was allowed a normally intolerant variety to survive complete inundation for 14 to 17 days. We then collaborated with David McKill, who has been studying this particular gene for many years. He works at the International Rice Research Institute. And he carried out precision breeding to introduce this gene into multiple varieties. So I want to give you a film to give you an idea of how effective this single gene is. And this is a time-lapse sequence that was conducted at the field station at the International Rice Research Institute. So in this situation, the field was artificially flooded. And on the left, you're going to see the variety that was developed through precision breeding, called the SUB1 variety. On the right, you'll see the other variety. So it's very fast. It's June through October, reduced to 40 seconds. So here they are planting. On the left, you see the SUB1 variety. Both varieties look really nice. Uh-oh, here comes the flood, completely submerged. And this is a recovery after the flood. And you can see the addition of this small genetic locus carrying the SUB1 genes. Here, I'll run it again for you. So, so here we go. Everything looks good. Then there's the flood. And now comes the recovery. And you can see which rice recovers faster. Now that recovery of this IR64 SUB1 rice translates directly into increased yield. So on the left, you can see IR64 SUB1 has 3.8 tons per hectare. On the right, the variety without SUB1 has 1.4 tons per hectare. So my collaborator, Dave McKill, has been busy at work, and he's now been able to introduce this locus. We call it a gene or a locus. It's a very small region of the chromosome from that FR13A variety. He's introduced it into about 6 different varieties that are normally intolerant. And this just shows you the example. Here's IR64 and IR64 SUB1 that I showed you. There's several other varieties that it's been introduced to. Here's Samba, Samba alone, Samba sub 1, and here are IR42, which is another variety, which is submergence intolerant. So this small region of the chromosome, now that we've been able to genetically characterize it, we can introduce it into locally adaptive varieties that are embraced by growers. So our team, we had a large team that just visited Bangladesh and India to see how the variety was behaving in those countries, both in field stations, under controlled conditions, and also in farmers' fields. So this is a photo I took just last week. This is Dr. Mazid at the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, and he's showing a difference between a variety that's favored in Bangladesh called Swarna. Here's Swarna sub 1 on the left and Swarna on the right. And this was after about 14 days of flooding. So in Bangladesh, then, this variety is very high yielding. And just to give you an example, it's estimated in just a single country in Bangladesh, 4 million tons of rice is lost every year to flooding. And 4 million tons of rice is enough to feed 30 million people for 1 year. So I think this demonstrates the real positive impact of genetics. So, of course, genetics is not the only solution to all our global agricultural problems, but it really is an important tool, and it can have a very dramatic impact. So we then were lucky enough to go into the farmer's field. So what I've shown you before were trials on field stations. Well, for the last 3 years, the seed has been given to farmers in both Bangladesh and India. So we went out to those small villages and we spoke with some of those farmers. She's speaking Oriya, which is the local dialect there. And what she's saying is she was surprised and very happy when she saw the sub 1 rice survive the flood. And then the children, we gave them a soccer ball. They didn't care about the rice. They just ran through the field with the soccer ball. This little boy is, I think, running home with the soccer ball, probably wants to hide it under his bed. So that was very fun for us. And then we went to India, and we had a village meeting that was set up by the local breeders who have been carried out a 3-year farmer study. And this was an opportunity to the farmers to meet us, for us to meet the farmers, for us to ask them questions about how the rice performed, and for them to ask us questions about what would be the difference? You know, this looks great, submergence tolerance, but are we bringing in any negative traits as well? And that was one of the questions they asked us, and the answer is, well, you know, we've brought in a really small region of the chromosome, so it's unlikely there will be detrimental effects, which is one of the advantages of genetic engineering or precision breeding. And I wrote about this trip on my blog, so if any of you want to journey to Bangladesh and India, you can check out that blog. So this was a place in Orissa, eastern India, that I mentioned before, in the village of Nagan. And here's one of the women at the meeting talking to us. And she made the point, which I thought was really important, because of the rice, because of this one variety, her family had more to eat, and they had more money because they were able to sell. They had some surplus rice. They were able to sell some of the rice. And it was a really great time. They put up this tent for us. It was decorated with cloth with Bengali tigers. It was really a very lovely time. So then it's the question, okay, that all sounds great, but are genetically engineered crops safe to eat? This is a very important question. The answer is clear, at least for those crops on the market, that really the scientific evidence is in that the crops that have been commercialized that are on the market are safe to eat. So the highest scientific agency in the nation is called the National Academy of Sciences. They've looked at this issue several times and have made this conclusion. But it's not only the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. Virtually every scientific society in every nation that has looked at this has made the same conclusion. The crops currently on the market are safe to eat. There has been about 1 billion acres planted over the last 10 years. There's not been a single case of adverse health or environmental impacts. And I want you to keep that in mind, considering that every year there's 300,000 deaths due to insecticide poisoning. So it's really important to keep perspective, risk perspective, when you're thinking about this. So there's no scientific basics for ruling out the process of genetic engineering. There may be philosophical reasons, but really scientifically, there's no scientific basis. And in fact, genetic engineering and precision breeding really present similar risks of unintended consequences as conventional breeding. And the reason for that is anytime you develop a new variety, there is some risk of some unintended consequences. With conventional breeding, you're mixing a lot of different genes together that haven't been characterized. And some argue there's less of a risk with genetic engineering because you know which gene that you're putting in. So clearly, though, each new crop must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And this goes for genetically engineered crops, but it also goes for crops that have been developed through conventional breeding. So just to summarize, we think that the farms of the future really must produce enough food in an affordable manner to feed the human population, but we really need to reduce the toxic inputs, minimize nutrient runoff, and soil erosion. We believe organic production practices and genetically engineered crops, as well as precision breeding, can have a major contribution to reaching these goals, just as plant breeding was of crucial importance to increase food production in the 20th century. So I want to just close with a quote from an environmental activist and visionary, Rachel Carson, from 1962, and I'll just read it. What she said was, a truly extraordinary variety of alternatives to the chemical control of insects is available. Some are already in use and have achieved brilliant success. Others are in the stage of laboratory testing. Still others are little more than ideas in the minds of imaginative scientists, waiting for the opportunity to put them to the test. All have this in common. They are biological solutions based on understanding of the living organisms they seek to control and of the whole fabric of life to which these organisms belong. Specialists representing various areas of the vast field of biology are contributing. Entomologists, pathologists, geneticists, physiologists, biochemists, ecologists, all pouring their knowledge and their creative inspirations into the formation of a new science of biotic control. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, that's a great question, and the two-part question asked, what do I think about the potential for resistance to Bt due to it being used in genetically engineered plants? And the second part of the question was, what do I feel about the residue of Bt going into the soil? The first question about resistance to Bt, I think that is a critical question, and there have been systems set up to try and prevent resistance from occurring. Growers that grow Bt crops are also required to grow a percentage of their crop that's not a Bt crop, so there's enough genetic diversity there to avoid resistance. And there's a researcher in Arizona, Bruce Tabashnik, who's done a lot of work on this, and he's shown that if these buffer areas are maintained, that he hasn't found that resistance occurs, but if these buffer areas are not maintained, then resistance indeed can come about. And this is this resistance question is one of the reasons that I would put the Bt crops in a group of crops that may or may not fit into a sustainable system. And it would depend on the area. It would depend on what sort of farming practices people had. But it's one of those crops that really needs to be evaluated and scrutinized. And from an organic farmer's point of view, it may be one that you say, well, I don't think that fits into a sustainable system. The second part of your question about the residue in the soil, I'm not an expert on that, but it's it's interesting to me that Bt, the bacteria, is a soil-borne organism. That's where it came from. So I'm somewhat less concerned about the residue in the soil and more concerned about the potential for resistance to Bt, which I find to be a very useful tool.
Maybe I could just add to that, I agree with what Raoul said, but one thing to think about is the only insects that have evolved resistance in organic fields. And that's because, possibly because BT's been used longer in organic fields, possibly because when the crop is genetically engineered, there's a more planned production. So there has not been insects that evolved resistance and created problems for farmers in genetically engineered crops. These problems so far have only occurred in organic situations.
I actually just read about a study that came out last year from the University of Arizona that showed that they were seeing resistance in Ebola.
Yeah, so that's Bruce Tabashnik, and that is a really important study. And what he showed, that there were some alleles that did develop resistance to Bt, but that these evolved in areas where there was not these alternative plantings. But he also showed that there were no, because they're alleles, they did not create epidemic of insect resistance. So his conclusion from that study is that this whole idea of integrating Bt and non-Bt crops works. We have to continue, and another point he makes is, I think your question is a very important question. It came up very early on when people started using Bt crops, and it was predicted that insects would evolve resistance, and it's somewhat surprised that insects have not evolved resistance more quickly.
So when addressing the environmental impact of the genetically engineered crops, do you take into account the introduction of these superplants into the ecosystem, which selects out like native variants? Because there's such, I don't know, they survive so well, they could almost take over these ecosystems if they were introduced outside of agricultural use.
So I think the question is that if you genetically engineer a crop and it's high yielding and highly productive, well, what if it takes over the ecosystem? It's an important question. The same question applies to conventionally bred crops. So everything that we eat, as I mentioned, has been conventionally bred. It has traits that have been domesticated and brought in by geneticists and breeders. So far to date, there's not been an example where a domesticated crop has invaded a native ecosystem. And the reason for that is, if you think about that corn variety, that thing cannot survive without the help of the farmers. You don't see, at least in our area, you don't see weedy corn around. So you have to think about, again, this idea of domesticated crops, whether it's through conventional breeding or genetic engineering. These crops are bred to feed us. They're bred for farmers. It's like a poodle, right? we don't see wild poodles running around. But, however, it's still an important question, and I think the attention brought because of genetic engineering has been really useful. People are starting to really stand back and say, okay, before we plant this crop, whether it's conventionally grown, conventionally developed, or genetically engineered, we need to think about the environment. So I think it's a good question.
Question down here.
Just a counterpoint. You say that none of the domesticated crops have been escaped to the environment and taken it over. The Rufus armeniacus, which you know as Himalaya blackberry, has done so in Oregon, from northern British Columbia down to San Diego, California.
Yeah, so the Himalayan blackberry, though, if I understand, weeds are definitely a problem. Invasive species are definitely a problem, but these are not domesticated species. These are weedy species. So weedy species have created tremendous problems. I mean, in California, we have grasses that have taken over our entire Central Valley, and they're exotic. They come from Europe. So they thrive in situations, in weedy situations. But actually, a highly domesticated variety itself has not, to my knowledge, invaded a native ecosystem.
Go in the back, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm kind of along the same veins. With our increased use of crop or plants for biofuels or oil crops such as camelina. It's a plant that occurs as an invasive, but we also cultivate it to create a product from it. What do you feel about integration between these populations that are genetically engineered and invasive populations that haven't been genetically engineered? Because, I mean, insects don't know those boundaries between, you know, two different types of plants.
Well, that's a good question. I think the question is, well, what about, you know, engineering types of weedy species for purposes that we want to take advantage of. And so we talk about this a little bit in the book. And you in Oregon are familiar with this case of bent grass. So we don't golf. We don't really care about bent grass so much. Excuse me if I don't want to offend the golfers. See, we offend everybody in this book. But bent grass is important for, as I understand it, for creating turf for golfing. So an herbicide tolerance gene was introduced into a weed. And it's not unpredictable that this would spread into another system because it's already a weed. So I think the idea of engineering weeds for purposes such as golfing would not fit onto our list of sustainable agriculture.
Could I add something to that?
This is the expert on creeping bent grass, who I met earlier today.
Because I would say that I agree with you that creeping bentgrass is not a super domesticated crop. It's not as, we cannot compare it in level of domestication with corn or wheat or rice or any other crop. But it's not a weed either. It's actually, there are varieties, different varieties that have been developed. There have been some breeding going on. So it's not, I would say it's not a weed, it's a crop that is less domesticated than some others that we consume.
It has weedy characteristics, as you pointed out today, which is producing a lot of seed.
Yeah, but that is different. It has different characteristics that make it unique in the sense that it has extra abilities to propagate that some annual crops that we are used to, like corn or wheat, don't have. But it is a crop. It's not a weed. I mean, the bentgrass breeders would not be too happy in hearing.
Sorry, we are offending people.
I mean, I agree that it's not domesticated, and maybe this is a case where that note that you were, that topic of considering each crop and each trait individually and paying attention to their characteristics in detail is very important in the fact of not
Thank you.
generalizing.
You, sir?
Yeah, I just wonder if you evaluate probably the most common genetically engineered crop is Roundup Ready soybeans in regard to your criteria for sustainable ag. Just a couple of points about that, like some of your criteria to protect biodiversity and reduce harmful environmental impacts. So right now, Roundup Ready soybeans are about 90% of what is being used in the U.S. to the point where a number of farmers that want to get non-Roundup Ready soybeans are finding it very difficult to even buy those seeds. Plus, although the herbicide use went down after it was originally introduced, now because of resistance to the Roundup and the Roundup Ready soybeans, it's actually been shown that pesticide use has gone up. So would you consider Roundup Ready soybeans sustainable ag?
Go ahead.
Did everyone hear that question? Because you spoke so loudly, I heard it. Okay. That's a great question of, well, what actually fits into a sustainable ag system? And I would I envision these sorts of questions being resolved in a room full of people that represent different aspects of agriculture and maybe consumers in our society. But that said, it seems like if you develop genetically engineered plants that are likely, where resistance is likely to develop to that trait, that's not a very well-designed trait. There's a researcher here on campus, Carl Munt? Chris Munt. Is he here? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He doesn't work on herbicides.
No. But he works on, if I'm correct, on mixed varieties of wheat and rice being used in fields. And I feel like that's a great example of using genetics to minimize the resistance of whether it's diseases or herbicides or insects to your crop. And I guess I'd like to see if there are going to be genetically engineered plants with really beneficial traits, I'd like to see them used in a way that maximizes the diversity of the genes within those plants. So instead of there being just one gene in the same variety of soybean planted over 2 million acres, I love the idea of a mix of varieties with a mix of genes. I don't know if that answered your.
Maybe I'll just add, kind of get my 2 cents in too. So there has been a lot of debate in the literature that you're probably familiar with about, well, herbicide-tolerant soybeans, is that actually increasing the amount of herbicide being used? And in different situations, we're seeing different answers to that. But again, it's location specific, but what is very clear is that the overall toxicity of the herbicide in the environment has dramatically decreased. And that's because Roundup is a relatively benign herbicide, and it's replaced more toxic herbicides such as metachlor, which is a cancer-causing, and atrazine, which are very serious problems, environmental problems. And the other point that we do make in the book is that herbicide-tolerant crops are not useful in less developed countries. They can't afford to buy the herbicide, so it's not something useful for less developed countries. But it may be useful, and it seem to be useful for farmers here in the sense that they can reduce tilling, use no-till agriculture, and just the other point I wanted to make about that is, so in the book I get in an argument with my sister, who is an environmental lawyer, and I wouldn't recommend getting an argument with a lawyer, but I did, and I put the argument in the book, and her point is, well, I don't want to use more herbicides, I don't want to use any inputs, and I respect that opinion, but this idea of development of resistance to the herbicide is really a problem of over-application of the herbicide. It's not an issue of genetically engineered crops, and in fact the same situation has occurred with naturally occurring mutants that are tolerant of the herbicide. So I didn't see that as a good argument to ban genetic engineering, but I don't think I convinced her. You can read the book and tell me what you think.
So back to the genetic resistance. So you've got your field of genetically resistant tomatoes. You harvest it, but the next crop you plant, you have volunteer tomatoes come up, they're going to be Roundup resistant. And then you've created a situation where your crops become weeds that are resistant to Roundup. And then it's going to foster the use of other herbicides to control the weeds.
Well, see, that's a great example of where you need organic farming practices to make it a more sustainable system, because an organic farmer is going to rotate their crops. So the next.
But you're still going to have, an organic farmer is not going to be using Roundup to begin with.
Well, that's true.
So,
well, so, no.
I'm talking about
So one thing I'd like to make clear is that what we're proposing here is the combination of a lot of organic farming practices with genetically engineered plants, but that's not an organic farm because legally in this country, using genetically engineered plants is not allowed in organic farming systems. What we're developing here is a sustainable agriculture for that 97% of the rest of this country that's not using cover crops, that's not rotating their crops, that's not trying to enhance beneficial insects. So in a sustainable system, there's not going to be monoculture. There's not going to be the same crop being planted in the same ground year after year. Kind of an interesting thing, when I looked at Oregon's pesticide use, the material that was used the most is metam sodium, which is a soil fumigant. So soil fumigants, they're used in strawberries in California, and they're used in situations where farmers want to grow the same crop in the same ground year after year after year. And it's not a sustainable system. It's a system that causes lots of different problems. And so I think that I don't know if first of all, I'm not sure if the Roundup Ready trait fits into a sustainable system. You have to weigh the benefits of no-till agriculture versus not. But if it does, if it's used by itself, it doesn't really form a sustainable system.
Maybe one or two more questions, and then we have some refreshments outside, so that's not the end. Let's make,
You've had your hand up for a long time.
couple more. You should.
So, you talk a lot about evaluation for sustainability, but what do you feel about the intellectual property laws? I think it was Pamela who touched on it a little bit, but do you think there should be patents for GM crops, or I just like
Yeah. The question was, should there be patents on GM crops? Right now, along with patents, plants are protected in a variety of ways. One is by creating hybrids, because you can't save seed from a hybrid. And if you look in seed catalogs, most of the varieties, many of the popular varieties for tomato and broccoli and melons and field corn especially, they're all hybrids. And so farmers growing corn around the country, they're all buying new seed each year. They don't save, they can't save their old seed if they're growing hybrids. Another way plants are protected is through the Plant Variety Protection Act, which basically is used mostly with open pollinated crops that have been developed by seed companies. So I guess I see a value in being able for a seed company or a plant breeder to protect their creative plant. And I have a funny story. There's a plant breeder in Davis who has developed this wonderful purple kale. And he spent a number of years developing this kale that we're fortunate enough to be able to grow at the student farm. But he doesn't have the money even to pay for the plant, the PVP, the Plant Varietal Protection Act, which is about $6,000, and he certainly doesn't have enough for a patent. So what he's done is nothing. So there's this variety that he's put a lot of work into, he wants to get some money out of, but he doesn't feel like he can. So almost no one gets to use it. And I think that's a greater tragedy than rewarding someone for developing a useful plant. That said, I'm really opposed to the idea of patenting genes. A variety is one thing, but a gene, I think, takes it too far.
And I have patented a gene. So, so the way we work this is a gene on my lab clone about, it's getting on 15 years now. It's a disease resistance gene. And what we did, it was funded by a nonprofit foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and when we came up with this gene, a lot of companies approached us and said, oh, you know, we want that gene. And it was a dilemma for me because we wanted to see the gene used broadly, and these companies were offering to develop new wheat varieties, new corn varieties that would use less pesticides, and that was very attractive to me. And of course, these companies have a very large power. But at the same time, because this was funded by a nonprofit corporation, because I work on rice, which is a crop for the less developed world, I felt very strongly that we had to make that gene available. So what we did is we sort of split the difference. So we developed what was called the Genetic Resources Recognition Fund, and UC Davis filed a patent application on that gene, and we licensed it. Well, it was never licensed, but this is a long story with options of licensing. We optioned to license to some agricultural companies, but just for use in corn and wheat in developed countries. And we made it clear that that gene should be put in the public domain in less developed countries. And on top of that, we were hoping that the companies would make a lot of money on our gene, because what we were planning to do is take some of those profits and return those profits to the country of origin. So this particular gene originated from West Africa, from a wild species. So we were hoping to plow that money back into some sort of land conservation program or farmer education program. That gene, however, was never taken up by the U.S. companies. It's sort of, you know, very faddish. They get really excited about something and then they drop it. But the fact that we made it publicly available has allowed the Chinese researchers to introduce it into their varieties, and they were very careful. So China is very careful. They don't want to pay any fees to American corporations. So once we said, no, you can use it, they have developed some genetically engineered rice that actually may be released this year. And in the case of the submergence tolerance rice, that we put into the public domain, we really wanted to get it out as fast as possible. So I think, again, it's important to think about what you can do with that gene and who it will benefit.
Is it okay if I have a quick follow-up?
Super quick.
Okay, super quick. So, well, with that, do you think government regulation will actually help some of those companies, maybe motivate them to buy into genetic modification more?
The companies are very motivated to do genetic engineering, and you know, some people say that the historical is a historical problem, right? If golden rice had come out first, some of you may be familiar with this. Golden rice was a genetically engineered rice for enhanced vitamin A production, and it's expected 200,000 children a year die from vitamin A deficiency. The research was funded again by a nonprofit Rockefeller Foundation. It's been put into local adaptive varieties. Some people feel that if that was the first product that came out, the whole concept of genetic engineering would have been embraced. But because some of the products came out first by these large corporations, and most people don't trust Monsanto. They were some of the makers of Agent Orange, right? So we don't want to trust corporations to control our food supply. It just doesn't make sense. You know, their job is to make a profit, hopefully satisfy their consumers, but their job is not to feed the world. So I think the point I wanted to make about regulation, it's very complicated, because right now we believe that we need to regulate genetically engineered crops. Maybe some conventional crops need to be better regulated. The problem is it's getting to be so costly. The only ones that can afford it are the large multinational corporations. And so we're kind of going into a circle here. We want these genetically engineered crops to benefit people that are very poor. And if some of that genetic potential is locked up in corporations that want it to profit here, it could hinder. So there are nonprofit corporations, nonprofit foundations, it's the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation, that are really putting a big effort into this whole issue of intellectual property, which is quite tangled up.